Hi, welcome to this presentation on protecting our fragile desert environments. My name is Chris Lecheminant, and I've been an explorer of the desert Southwest since I was a little kid, so well over 50 years. And over the last 20 years or so, I've been in the desert Southwest a lot. It's been a passion of mine, and I've been hesitant to share specific information about those trips because I worry that social media creates too much of a spotlight on these areas and they get overrun, and in many cases they actually have. And a friend of mine suggested that what I ought to do is start educating people on how to handle the desert and protect the fragile environment. And that is the purpose of this particular video. I do want you to know that this is really for educational purposes only. It's not meant to be any kind of guide in the backcountry for you. You shouldn't rely on this information to keep you safe. That's your job. And as you can see in this disclaimer, it's pretty specific about your responsibility to be able to keep yourself safe and protected in the desert backcountry. Also, a note that I don't receive any compensation for any of the equipment I feature or have you consider using in your desert exploration. It's just simply what I've used and on occasion what I've liked. And so don't feel like there's any kind of motive in any of the equipment that I feature. I'm not compensated in any way. Like I mentioned, I've been an explorer of the desert backcountry since I was very young. Um, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we used to head out into Utah and Arizona and the desert Southwest quite a bit when I was younger, and got away from it for many years when I lived in the Pacific Northwest. But when I moved to Utah in the early 90s, my kids were still young, and that was a challenging time in my employment where we didn't get out that much. But in the very late 90s and then starting in the early 2000s, I really got back into exploring the desert Southwest, and it's been a passion of mine all my life. The areas that I tended to spend most of my time in, Canyonlands National Park and the surrounding areas of Canyonlands, all three districts of the Canyonlands National Park area, as well as BLM, Bureau of Land Management areas around there as well. In particular, I jumped into, I switched from exploring the backcountry in my Jeep to backpacking in the backcountry, specifically in Canyonlands, Salt Creek, and then most recently the Chesler Park, Elephant Canyons areas of the Needles District. I've also had the great pleasure of exploring Buckskin Gulch and Paria Canyon and some of the surrounding areas above and below that, where where I've had a chance again to backpack through those regions as well as day hike. Also, I've had the chance to explore a lot of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument area. Actually got into Coyote Gulch, which is one of the featured places in Grand Staircase, but well before it was a national monument. I think I was 9 years old the first time I um, hiked into Coyote Gulch, and I do remember my dad mentioning that this area was the last to be mapped, and I'm trying to remember if we even had maps at that time. I don't know, but uh, Grand Staircase is a great place to explore as well. And again, I've done that a lot since when I was younger in the 2000s and beyond. I show this picture because this is an area um, where you can get into Coyote Gulch from the rim down, called Crack in the Wall. And I don't know if this particular place that somebody stepped off the trail, but you can see how the erosion can be very significant and impactful in an area. And a lot of times it begins by somebody stepping off trail. And we'll talk about that more. But the point is, the desert looks like it's tough. It's a tough, tough place. Tough on us as individuals, but it's actually a very, very fragile environment. And just small errors on our part can cause tremendous changes in the desert environment that are not good. There are a lot of resources that are available to help us learn how to handle ourselves properly in the desert backcountry. Excuse me. There are the two that I've looked at, and one of them is the Tread Lightly organization, treadlightly.org, and you can find some great principles there. The acronym for TREAD is how it's more easily remembered what we can do. And really, quite frankly, when I look at the acronym, I think of the E and the A most of all. Educate yourself and then avoid sensitive areas. It's those sensitive areas that we misunderstand as being so critical to needing protection because, like I said before, one step in the wrong place and you could start the erosion process and really cause tremendous damage over time. So I'm going to focus though on the leave no trace principles because those are the ones I'm most familiar with. I spent 8 years as a volunteer scoutmaster of a scout troop, and we did a lot of exploring of the desert backcountry as part of our outdoor experience. Um, as much as I tried to train those scouts on leave no trace principles, it was often lost on them. And it didn't take me long to decide that there were specific places I would take them and a lot of places I would not because they just weren't mature enough to handle those leave no trace principles properly as much as we would talk about them. But even though that was the case, I learned a lot about leave no trace principles and following those principles and how important it is in the desert backcountry. So we're going to use the leave no trace principles as our guide for the rest of this presentation. There are many, 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 many different ways we can protect the desert Southwest. And my intention here is to cover everything. I'm just going to cover some of the ones that I have found personally to be very, very helpful. And by no means is a comprehensive view of protecting the desert Southwest. But I hope as you go through this with me that you'll learn some things that you can do to help protect the desert Southwest, in addition to understanding that there's a lot more you can learn. So focusing first on plan and prepare, the very first leave no trace principle, my opinion is that this one is the most important because a lot of times if you don't plan and prepare properly, you end up breaking the other rules or principles of leave no trace simply as a matter of survival, perhaps, or just to get yourself out of a tough situation. So I think if we focus our attention mainly on plan and prepare, the rest will fall into line very well. Well, one of the things you need to understand is the desert Southwest, as I mentioned, is very fragile and very vulnerable. And so the same rules may be different, not leave no trace rules, but there may be rules in place in certain areas that are not the same in other areas. For example, if we were in the Needles district of Canyonlands, and you wanted to do some backcountry exploration, you need to know in advance that if you have a dog, you're not going. If you thought you were going to ride your mountain bike, you're not going into the backcountry on many of these trails. Dogs are not allowed, bikes are not allowed. So you want to understand those limitations in advance. So you do your research about where you're going into the backcountry. Find out from the managing jurisdiction, whether it's a national park or a Bureau of Land Management or a state park or even some state jurisdiction. But either way, you want to find out what are the rules and how am I going to prepare properly so I don't break those rules. And as we're going to talk about, be able to easily uh, follow the leave no trace principles. One of the best ways to do that in the national park system is to go directly to the visitor center prior to your heading into the backcountry. In many cases, they may, if you're overnighting anywhere in the backcountry, you're probably going to need permits in advance. If you're just day hiking in and out, you probably won't need those, but you don't know unless you find out. The other thing I love about checking in with the visitor centers is they generally have up-to-date information on the conditions of the backcountry where you may be going. So very, very helpful to check in first with the visitor centers if they are available. As you head into the backcountry, it may be that you're doing what I did in the early years with my family, and that's drive into the backcountry on established dirt roads. And one thing I learned very quickly was when I'm doing that kind of activity, heading into the backcountry and driving in, is I realized that it was a good idea to prepare as though I have to provide my own self-rescue. So I brought everything I could think of that made sense to me to provide for my own self-rescue, and that included a hand winch system where come along pulley where I could potentially, if needed, hand crank my vehicle out of a ditch or something if I needed to. Um, Tow straps and a full spare tire and other things like that. Tools to effect a repair if I needed. All of those things I try anticipating that nobody's coming to help me. I learned that really from my days of whitewater rafting. I started rafting when I was 15 years old and been rafting for, what would that be, almost 50 years. And we knew that self-rescue was the number one option whenever we were river rafting. And I think that can be true as well for us exploring the backcountry by vehicle or on foot. That self-rescue is probably the most reliable option that we have. I found it interesting too that in carrying that self-rescue stuff with me, I've never had to use it for me personally to get out of a bad situation, but I've actually used it a number of times for other people that were stuck in a bad situation. So that's another part of it I think is helpful as we do have each other's back in the back country and uh, know that it's good to stop if somebody has stopped and make sure they're okay. I always like to ask people if they have enough water, because having enough water in the backcountry is a critical piece as well. The other thing about traveling on back roads in the desert Southwest is roads are often in pretty good shape. You know, they're well graded and they look great. But the moment there's a significant amount of rain, they become very, very treacherous. It's almost like somebody has greased the road. They are just so slippery. I've had situations where the mud would cake on the tires in layers so that it looked like I had huge tires, but it was just a couple of inches of mud stuck to my tires, and very difficult situations to get through because it doesn't matter if you had four-wheel or 12-wheel drive, all those wheels are going to spin in the mud. So you want to make sure you're avoiding backcountry roads as good as they may be when they're dry in wet situations. Not uncommon that we'll pull over and wait. The interesting thing about the desert Southwest is it's so dry that when it does rain, it usually doesn't take long for the roads to dry out. Maybe an hour or two, and we can be back on the road without sliding all over in the mud and really churning up the roads into rutted messes as well. But as we look at maps and prepare for our journey into the backcountry, you need to understand that dirt roads are not created equal. It could be a dirt road like you see in this picture, where it's well graded and even a passenger vehicle in good weather conditions can handle most of it. But a lot of times it may be a road where low range four-wheel drive is required and it still shows it as a dirt road like any other dirt road. So doing your homework and making sure you don't get stuck in the backcountry is very, very helpful, and that you're not going off of the established dirt roads that are out there. Um, that I've seen some pretty significant damage on back roads simply because somebody is trying to avoid something in front of them and they drive off the established road around it. And we don't really want to do that, especially if you don't have the right kind of vehicle to do that. When I talk about the right kind of vehicle, really what I'm talking about is there's all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive vehicles, and they're not the same thing. All-wheel drive, in my opinion, is really a description of all weather types of driving, not all kinds of road types of driving. And true four-wheel drive vehicles, they do have that low range feature, and they do have a system that's much more capable when it comes to four-wheel drive conditions. The picture at the top of this particular slide is a vehicle of people in a hiking party of ours that we were heading out to Crack in the Wall to hike Coyote Gulch, and they got into the deep sand and they just couldn't move that vehicle, though all the four-wheel drive vehicles had no problem at all. So we had to pull them through this deep sand until we got back onto more compact roads before they could keep going. Had they been on their own, they would have been stuck until someone else came, because even digging them out was not working. Another thing I think is helpful to recognize, we can do a nice practice that will keep us safer in the backcountry and not tearing up the area that isn't designated as a place we can drive or park, is when you park at a trailhead that's out in the backcountry, park so that you can access the battery if the battery is dead without having to pull up right next to the vehicle. You'll notice in this picture that the Jeeps are backed into their parking places. That happens to be my daughter and I we were both in Jeeps out in the back country together, and we backed them in so that if either one of them needed a jump start, we could do it by just simply pulling up nose to nose. I do understand that there are some vehicles where the battery is located somewhere else than under the hood. Know where your battery is, and then park in a way that someone could pull right up and if you needed to, and you'll find that to be very helpful. I learned this one not necessarily the hard way, but the green Jeep was the the headlights mechanism failed and the headlights went on automatically. Whether it was on or off, the headlights could turn on. Didn't know that. We had parked out at the Crack in the Wall trailhead, did the hike, and when we came back in another vehicle after we'd finished the hike, the battery was dead because the lights had been on for 3 days or 4 days, whatever it was. And luckily, I was in a there somebody had left one of the parking places next to the Jeep so I could pull up and we could charge it, we could get it jumped. Otherwise, I'm not sure what I would have done. I suppose we could roll it back and then try and jump start it, but wouldn't it just be easier to always back in and be in a position where you can just pull right up and jump the vehicle? Just a good thing to know. Also, you want to understand what kind of natural obstacles and possibilities for dangers are present wherever you may be going. Um, I went to hike Ding and Dang canyons in central Utah, a couple of slot canyons, and this sign was at the trailhead. I think it's a fairly new sign. We had done our research anyway, and we knew that we may need some ropes here and there to work our way through different places in the slot canyon. So we brought rope anyway. But a lot of people don't if they just think, what a fun thing, and they run off and do something without doing any research. Know in advance what you're going to need for equipment and to keep yourself safe. One of the big challenges of canyon country is they do have a tendency to flash flood. That's pretty much how they're made. It's a lot of flash flooding and water doing a lot of the work in creating these canyons. And so we need to also pay very close attention to the weather forecast, not only for the specific area where we're going to be, but the greater surrounding area as well, because those flash floods or the water from storms could come from miles and miles away from us. This is a picture in Buckskin Gulch, and you notice that there's a log very high up in the canyon wall that tells me how high at times the flash flooding could be. And so it's very humbling and a little disconcerting to see those kinds of indications of what flash flooding can do. But it also keeps us grounded when we have to make that choice based on weather conditions, whether to go or not go into the canyon country. And so very, very important that you pay attention to those kinds of indicators of what may be coming our direction when it comes to weather. Again, one of the issues we can face is if we do find ourselves in a difficult situation, the rescue process could be um, damaging to our fragile backcountry when equipment and vehicles and people are trying to get to us if we are in trouble. This is a picture in an area close to Ding and Dang canyons. This is actually in Little Wild Horse Canyon where a storm came through very rapidly. We knew this there was a storm off in the distance. Didn't think it was close to us. My mistake. Anyway, we got into the area of this slot canyon, and we were at a place where we could get to high ground when the rain hit. And while we were on that high ground, the flash flooding started coming through, waterfalls coming off the canyon walls, and we just simply had to wait it out. And then once we knew the storm had passed and the water was beginning to recede and slow down, we could make our way back out of the canyon. Also, it's important to recognize that a lot of times these trails, I mean, the big joke is when we look at a map, we can say, well, it was flat on the map, the trail was flat on the map. But in canyon country, a lot of canyons box out, meaning you go up the canyon to a point where you can't go any further, or you're going up and over lots of saddles between canyons. And in the Needles district, particularly out to Chesler Park and Elephant Canyon and other areas near there's lots of up and down. And you need to be aware of those and ready to handle that kind of environment. And again, not find yourself out stuck somewhere where the potential for damaging the environment is there because somebody has to rescue you. Also recognize that there can be some pretty serious um, potential for for harm in that you're working across canyon walls. This is an area where when I first hiked it, I couldn't believe that this was the trail at first. That the, but there was nowhere else to go. It had to be the trail, and it was marked accordingly. But that's a long way down if you slip, and there's very little foothold in that section of what's called the Peekaboo Trail in the Needles District. I think it's very important too that you come prepared with physical maps. A lot of people will rely on their phones and maps they've downloaded, but who knows? You could drop your phone, you could break your phone, you could lose the power. Something could happen where you no longer have that digital device to rely on. And I'm a huge fan of having, at least as a backup, a paper map. I Early in my exploration, I went without maps a couple of times, and I just won't do that anymore because being able to have a good map to help you find your way not only will keep you safe, but it also keeps you from going off trail into areas that you could damage because trails shouldn't be there. Always make sure that you do bring the right equipment and have it with you. A good friend of mine. He's an old mountain man, just a great guy. He helped me in my scouting activities and other things like that. He used to just simply say it this way. His old mountain man adage was, if you didn't bring it, you don't have it. And it's really that simple. And so, I do try and focus on minimizing the weight of what we carry, like we should when we're backpacking, especially. But I also don't like to be unprepared either. And so I like to bring those things that will keep me safe in the back country and and have a good experience when I'm out there, especially when I'm multi-day backpacking. Now, one of the things in the desert Southwest I think is critical is having the ability to access water when you need it, if it's available to us, meaning I'm going to carry a water filter. Now, I don't think for desert backcountry all water filters are created equal. I have a couple of Hiker Pro, Katadyn Hiker Pro water filters. The problem with those is they're paper filters, and they work great in the Clearwater mountain streams. They'll go and go and go, but in the more turbid or the ones that have more um, sediment, particularly the desert Southwest, that can be a problem in a hurry. As soon as a paper filter clogs up, it's no longer usable. You cannot filter water. So I like to carry ceramic water filters. There's a new one called the Guardian that's not ceramic filter. It purges the water as it's pumping the water. So most of the sediment is purged out automatically, and it's the best filter I've ever seen. And I love it when someone has a Guardian filter. But I have the cheaper ceramic MSR filter and a Katadyn pocket. And when they clog up, you just simply clean the filter off, the ceramic filter off in the dirty water, and then you put it back on and you can keep filtering. So I'm always going to carry a water filter, not expecting water in the back country, but if I got in a situation where I needed more water and water was available, I have that option, and it's worth the wait for me to carry a water filter. I also, when I'm doing backcountry camping, I like to bring a collapsible bucket so I can settle water overnight before filtering it, and that helps to keep that water filter clean and pumping more water as well. So I find that to be helpful. And then I found that the jet boil system has been for me the most efficient backcountry stove system, and I don't have to carry nearly as much fuel when I'm using a jet boil. I used to go through with 7 people on a trip. I could go through two and a half of these. I'll call them standard size fuel canisters, where a jet boil I'll probably use a third of it, maybe a half on the same trip, because they're so much more efficient. So I like to do that as well. The other thing I really like a lot is having the option to carry more water than just what I have in my personal hydration bag and then supplemental Nalgene bottles as well. And this MSR, they call it the dromedary bag, 10-liter dromedary bag, I think is fantastic. I got the one that is the heavy duty one. Okay, so it weighs more, but I'm okay with that because in the backcountry, there's the cactus and the very rough foliage and sticks and whatever, and poking a hole in a regular um, thin um, hydration bag is a lot more likely. And so I love this one because it's tough. It is very tough. The other thing I like to do is I get the 10-liter, not the 6 or the 8-liter, because I can always fill it up to 10 liters if I really wanted to. I can put a lot less than 10 liters in it. I have the option to go up to 10 liters, where if I got a 6-liter, that's the most I can put in it. And I found in a lot of my backcountry experience where water sources are more scarce that I do end up putting about 6 to 8 liters in my 10-liter bag, Or if all I'm carrying is water, like I've dropped most of the contents of my backpack in camp and then went for water using my regular backpack with it mostly empty, I could carry 10 liters plus others and not have it be too much weight for me as long as my camping gear is out of my backpack when I go to get water. So this is something you might want to consider as well. Again, if you're not desperate for water and searching all over the place and creating new trails where they shouldn't be trying to find water, you're more likely to protect our fragile backcountry. I also like to find the type of equipment that works best for me as well as minimizes the weight so I can back myself up with these other things. I found for me the Osprey backpack is amazing. Um, Big Agnes tents are very lightweight. My problem with the Big Agnes tent now is that I've used them for so long that they're wearing out because the fabric is much thinner, hence lower weight. And I'm starting to lean towards replacing those with something like the REI tents because they're tougher. They're thicker, they're heavier, but they're tougher, and I think it's worth the extra weight for me. But that would be in the future. But the idea here is we want to be careful that we're not overloading ourselves. Plus, if I have lighter equipment, I can handle carrying more water when water is scarce. And then you got to remember if you're doing backcountry exploration that your backpack is the thing that's going to carry everything. And so you want to get the right backpack, the right size backpack. Personally, I found that a 70-liter backpack, I have the Osprey Ather, that has been for me. I almost bought the bigger one, the 80-liter, and I realized that I'd probably fill that up too if I had 80 liters. So 70 liters is, for me, tends to be about the right amount to carry what I need, but not carry too much. So that's something to consider as well. And again, we protect the backcountry when we're well prepared. The other thing I think is critical when it comes to preparing for backcountry exploration is taking good care of our feet. That's our way in and out. This is a picture of one of my early trips into Salt Creek Canyon in Canyonlands National Park, and I had shoes that were a little too tight. And by the fourth day, I had taped every single toe because they were rubbing together and causing blisters. Heels were covered. It was not all that good. And I've learned a lot since then on how to protect and take care of my feet. Number one being the right shoes. And so I'm very particular about the shoes I wear when I go backcountry exploring. And I'm willing to pay the price for good shoes. And if you think about it, if you buy cheaper shoes just because you don't want to pay that much, you could spoil the majority of your trip simply because your feet are all messed up. I found some good items that help us when we do have some issues with our feet. The blister treatment patch is something that I've found to be super helpful. I have bony, really bony heels, and so I can easily get a blister on the back of my heel, right where the picture is showing a patch. And I've had those issues, and when I put the blister patch on, they have medication built into them and they'll stay on for days. And I found that if I put one of those on when I first start getting a hot spot there, that they'll last usually the length of the trip without any more issues with blisters. You may have different experiences, and they do these blister patches are more they're for more than just heels. But they can be very good, and I always bring some extras. I found that a lot of times other people need them more than I do now, and happy to be able to help them. Also, there's a couple of kinds of tape that I found just in the last couple of years, recommended to me by friends that have been very, very helpful as well. The Luco tape is the pinkish fabric tape. It's thicker, and then the white tape is very thin, referred to as skin tape. And both of those have been fantastic in managing feet when it comes to blisters or potential blisters. And so those would be something you might consider to protect your feet in the backcountry as well. And then a good recommendation from a friend of mine that I found to be very, very helpful is I put some of the three kinds of tape I like to bring: duct tape, leukotape, and skin tape. I wrap some around my trekking poles so they're available to me very easily. Now, you could be in a situation where it's wet or you're anticipating it to be wet or very muddy. I wouldn't do that because it would ruin the tape. But when I'm in dry backcountry, generally dry backcountry experiences, it works great to have them on my trekking poles, easily accessible, take care of blisters very quickly, and we're back on. I also carry extra in a first aid kit if by chance we do end up in a wet situation and it gets damaged. I stick good tape in my first aid kit. One other thing to be aware of when you're planning and preparing properly is know when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down, and make sure that you're allowing enough time to be able to get to your destinations while the sun is still shining, or you could find yourself off trail and damaging, damaging the back country. This is a picture at Crack in the Wall before we headed down into Coyote Gulch, and this was after we had had trouble with that friend who got bogged down in the deep sand, and we ended up a couple of hours behind schedule. And so the sun was on its way down before we even dropped into Coyote Gulch, and we ended up hiking in the dark for a little ways. That's another reason why I'm bringing this up is not only do we want to know when the sun goes down and plan accordingly, but always carry a headlamp. Always carry a headlamp. Even when I'm day hiking, I carry a headlamp. I've had two situations where I've been caught in the dark where well, actually more than two as I think about it, and having a headlamp was critical to being able to get to where I needed to be. And so I'm a huge fan of always having a headlamp with me as well. And when we do that, we're protecting the backcountry by not ending up in places we shouldn't be. The second leave no trace principle is travel and camp on durable surfaces. And again, this is one that I think is super critical in the backcountry of the desert because it's so fragile. When we are in the backcountry and we're camping in the backcountry, more than likely we're going to be camping in places designated by the managing jurisdiction, especially the National Park System. They generally have places where you camp and you get reservations in advance. If you find yourself camping at large, where you don't have a designated campsite you're supposed to be in, make sure it's a place where camping has already happened a lot. As you can see in this picture, very well established camping area in Salt Creek. And that's what we want to be doing. Camp in areas that have already had camps, obvious camps there, and don't create new camps in other places where uh, we would then be damaging the backcountry. Also, we want to stay on established trails. That's an easy one, you would think, but one of the challenges of the backcountry in the desert is somebody goes off trail and their footprints make some pretty obvious tracks, and it could be misunderstood as the way to go, and then somebody else walks there. It only takes a couple of people walking off trail to give the impression that that is a trail. So be very careful about that. Stay on established trails. And a lot of times in the desert backcountry, what we'll find is if there is a trail that is not supposed to be a trail, right where the junction happens, there'll either be a few sticks laid down to block it. Not that you couldn't step right over it, but that's the indication that that's not a trail, or something laying across that junction so that it's an indicator that you shouldn't go that direction. So pay attention to those as well so that you can stay on the proper trails, and these other trails that shouldn't be trails can start to rehabilitate. When we're on slick rock, when we're on the hard sandstone, very difficult to know where the trails are because footprints aren't established in most of them unless it's well traveled. And so cairns are often put in place to be able to identify the trails. When we look at cairns, they're those stacked rocks, and that's spelled Cairns, cairns. And cairns are what we're looking for. Now, the rule here is that as the general public, we are not supposed to be building cairns, and we're definitely not supposed to be knocking down cairns. So we don't build cairns, we don't knock them down. That's the work of our national park rangers or others who are um, the professionals, we could say, in maintaining the backcountry trails. Uh, Part of the problem with that is they we may not know the exact route we're supposed to go, and if we're building cairns, we could be building them in a direction we shouldn't be. One of the challenges of hiking out to Crack in the Wall, at least the last few times I've done it, is there are people are putting cairns up all over the place, and sometimes you really don't know if you're on the right trail or not heading out to Crack in the Wall because you're on slick rock, and there are multiple cairns that aren't quite making sense because they're going in different directions. That's because people who don't quite know are often trying to put cairns up. So we don't build them, we don't take them down. Now this is the biggest deal about the backcountry, in my opinion. We have what's called cryptobiotic soil, and this is soil where microorganisms are working together to create this crust, this hard crust on the top of the sand that turns into erosion control. So in this picture, we can see that the trail is marked by the green arrows that say yes, and there's that dark section of dirt off to the left where it says no. That's cryptobiotic soil. Now, cryptobiotic soil, we like to use an acronym to help us remember not to step on it. It's don't bust the crust. Don't bust the crust. And that's the cryptobiotic soil, but it takes decades and decades for it to establish. It's slow growing organisms that turn into this. We can destroy it in one footstep. And then that footstep can remain for years um, before the cryptobiotic soil can grow back. The other problem is as soon as there's water from rain or well, rain and gathering and creating streams is it'll find the lowest point. Your footprint is probably the lowest point. So now it runs into that, runs out of that, and especially if you've walked in, out to through the crypto soil, there's a good chance that that's going to turn into a stream bed and then significant erosion can happen from there. And so very, very important that we never bust the crust, that we stay off the cryptobiotic soil. I'll even choose to zigzag on the slick rock between little sections of potholes with cryptobiotic soil in it if need be to avoid the crypto. So that's a big one. And probably the biggest rule of all in the desert southwest when it comes to uh, traveling on durable surfaces. Be very, very careful. The third leave no trace principle is to dispose of waste properly. Now we all know that we don't throw our garbage around, and hopefully, if you're heading into the backcountry, you're not one of those that would even think about leaving any kind of garbage behind. That's just super bad form, right? And even in the front country, even in your own front yard, we don't throw stuff. We don't throw our garbage on the ground. We always dispose of it properly. But when we get into the desert backcountry, there's, especially if we're multi-day uh, traveling in the backcountry, we reach a whole nother level of dispose of waste properly. And that's the disposing of human waste. Now, when I first did the Salt Creek trip in the Needles District of Canyonlands, 2011 was my first backpacking trip there. And even in a few years beyond that, actually a lot of years beyond that, um, the the rule was you would dig a cat hole and you would bury your human waste and carry out the toilet paper, because the toilet paper doesn't break down at all for many, many years in the backcountry. And unfortunately, human waste takes a long time as well. But I'm seeing this really huge push in the direction of we carry out our human waste no matter what. If it's not a vault toilet or a flush toilet, an actual toilet system, then you got to carry it out. And I'm okay with that. I think that's actually very, very important as more and more people are interested in accessing the backcountry. It's more and more important that we have systems with us that can carry out human waste. And we call those WAG bags. It's an acronym, and I don't remember what it means, but WAG bags. And the one I found to be the best for me is that silver one. I think it's a Rest Stop 2, and a proper WAG bag has a powder in it. There's probably a scientific name, but it's usually called poo powder. And because it has poo powder in the bag, when you seal it up, it breaks it down so it's actually okay to be thrown into regular landfills, unlike bags of poop, right? You're not able to do that. But as long as it has the poop powder, it turns into regular waste. And so I always like to bring, even when I'm day hiking, at least one wag bag in case I need to do my business in the back country because we don't get to bury it anymore. Cat cat holes are no longer allowed in most of the desert Southwest. So that's good to be prepared. And one thing that people don't realize about wag bags is even though they seal and you can roll them up tight, they still can smell, unfortunately. And so what I like to do is bring a mesh bag. As you see in this picture, it could be a potato sack, it could be an onion. Onion bags are great. This mesh bag is actually part of that Rest Stop 2 system that you can buy the wag bags and the mesh bag. And the nice thing about that is instead of stuffing your used wag bag into your backpack where it can uh, the odor can spread to other things, which is gross. You carry it on the outside and you don't have to worry about it. So you got your wag bag on, the mesh bag on the outside to carry used wag bags. And then I also like to have two lightweight small carabiners, one to clip to the top, one to clip to the bottom. A lot of times we think, oh, just one will do it, and then it swings on us while we're in the back country. Instead, if you clip it at top and bottom, it'll stay put. It's not swinging around bothering you as you're heading down the trail with a big backpack on, or a day pack even. The fourth leave no trace principle is leave what you find. Again, this is one where we think, okay, we get it. You don't haul out stuff, and in the desert backcountry, it's really critical because we have a lot of artifacts of the ancient cultures that lived in those regions before. Those artifacts include pottery and arrowheads. And this is a picture of a bunch of pottery that was gathered together and placed in one place at Big Ruin in Salt Canyon. And the problem with this, and this a ranger told me this, and I didn't think of it before until they mentioned it. They said the problem with gathering it together like this is there's a lot of pottery in front of us. And so it's easy for us to think, oh, no one will miss one piece and it only takes a dozen people or more, and then most of the pottery's gone. So we're to disperse it. If we don't have to throw it out if it's already there, but when you find something, don't gather everything together in one place. That's not considered a good thing because the temptation is there that we're not going to leave what we find. Also, we have the rock art from these native cultures. When rock art is carved into the stone, it's called a petroglyph. And when it's painted on the stone, it's called a pictograph. And one of the challenges, and we see them frequently, is people will want to carve their initials or their name and the date. When I was younger in the early 60s, that was not considered bad, and people did it all the time. They'd carve their initials in the rock. We don't do that anymore. And not only do we leave what's in place, we leave intact what's there as well when it comes to the rock art. So no carving on the rock art. But you also want to be aware that your hands have natural oils on them. And we don't even want to touch the rock art because our oily hands can start to break down uh, the rock art, unfortunately. Particularly when it's pictographs, the painted on the rock stuff. That's really bad form if we were to touch those paintings, the pictographs. So we stay away from those. We don't touch them. We just simply observe them from a short distance. Also, the ruins that we find in the desert Southwest. One of the fun things is to go out and find the ruins. Is you don't want to ever climb in or on the ruins or lean on them. They're very fragile, and being on or in them can cause them to break down. You can knock them over on accident, and there it is. It's thousands of years being intact, and you're the one who knocks it over. So we don't want to do that either. So we don't get into the ruins, and there is a rule that we don't camp within. I think it's 200 yards of a ruin. I just don't camp near them, and all will be well. But that's part of leaving what we find is leaving it as good as it was, or even better if possible. If we find some litter or something, clean it up. The fifth is minimize campfire impacts. This is one that I've learned. I learned early on in our rafting days. We started rafting in the mid 70s, whitewater rafting, and my dad never would build fires. And I thought that was interesting because a lot of people did, especially when you get into these narrow river corridors. There's a lot of use in a very small amount of space, and fire scars are just awful. They're just terrible, terrible things. And so we never want to be creating fire scars anyway. And so, really, the best rule of thumb is to simply build fires only when there's established fire pits and established campgrounds, and avoid fires altogether in the backcountry. They're just it's just not good. And then when we think about the desert Southwest, wood is so scarce anyway. It takes so long for a tree to grow in the desert that burning it up is just not a good thing. And all the nutrients that we've destroyed that could have gone back into the soil through decay are no longer available to that environment. So we want to keep it as pristine and natural as we can by simply avoiding those impacts of fires, which again means most of the time you're just not going to build one. So if we didn't plan or prepare properly and we didn't bring enough fuel for our jet boil, what are you going to do to be able to eat? You're probably going to build a fire in a place that didn't have one. So back to planning and preparing being so important for us. But here again, this one's pretty simple. Don't build fires unless it's in a campground with a fire pit. Number six, respect wildlife. Now, this one is pretty straightforward. Common sense would be don't kill things just simply to kill them. Don't throw rocks at the squirrels and stuff like that. Yes, we get that part. But in the desert backcountry, one of the biggest challenges is water, a lack of water, very limited water supplies. And so we always want to make sure we're protecting the water sources as as much as we possibly can. So we don't wash or bathe in the streams or ponds or pools of water in the desert backcountry. Never, never, never. If you do feel like you need to get clean, I bring the collapsible bucket, but I rarely use it for this reason. But you could take some water and then go way away from the water source in order to wash up. That would be ideal. But be very, very careful that none of the soaps or even the suntan lotion residue is something that's getting into these streams because it may be a very limited water source for a lot of different kinds of wildlife. And the last one is be considerate of others. This one, we all have our opinions about the place of music in our lives. I love music. I love to listen to music all the time. But when I get into the desert backcountry, I'm one of those that loves to get into the desert because it's so quiet, and the peace and calm of the desert to be able to disconnect from electronic devices is something I want to do, and a lot of people do. And so my recommendation here is if you gotta listen to music while you're in the backcountry, bring the earbuds and don't broadcast it out for others to hear if they because they have no choice but to hear it because you're playing it. Please don't do that. And I've seen more and more and more people are hanging the Bluetooth speaker on their backpack and cranking it up as they're traveling in the backcountry. Please don't do that because many of us are there for the solitude and you're not giving us that opportunity. Also, when we're camping, in established campgrounds, the general rule is no noise like generators after 10 p.m. anyway. But in areas of the backcountry, it's not uncommon that I'll hear the music blaring. And again, I go into the backcountry, I go camping to get away from all that. I think it's critical to our well-being to disconnect and experience silence for extended periods of time. And anytime someone is blasting the music or running their generator late or whatever they're doing that's loud, it's disrupting that opportunity for us to have that peace and quiet that we're looking for. So just as a review, the leave no trace principles, in my opinion, are an excellent starting point, at least for being able to protect our fragile desert Southwest. And I hope you take these to heart as you go into the desert Southwest. My hope is that as more and more people are discovering the amazing opportunities the desert Southwest provide for us, that we'll all be going with this education understood that it is a fragile environment and that we're going to do all we can to protect it. And I shared with you just some of the many things we can do to help protect our natural environments, our beautiful, beautiful desert Southwest. I hope that you have plenty of fantastic experiences in the desert Southwest, that you come to love it as much as I have, or more, and that you find memorable moments over and over and over again as you get into the desert Southwest and find the peace and beauty that's there for you and you and me, and everyone else. Thank you for taking the time to enjoy this presentation.